Hey all, just a quick 60 seconds here before I get into the rankings. This video is part of a longer audio podcast that can be found linked in the description. The podcast format this week includes more detail about the scouting criteria and also includes my running backs ranked 3 through 10. Those running back rankings will be part of a video later this week, but I still have to produce that video. On that note, the production is still very much a work in progress, but if you'll notice from the previous 3 videos, the graphic quality is at least better in this one. I also hope to improve the audio equipment shortly, which will of course improve the audio quality. This is by no means the final product at this point, and I want to continue to grow the show and improve the show as well. If you enjoy and want to support the continued growth of the content, please make sure to like the video as it will help more people see the video as well. Now on to my top 7 wide receiver recap before going into my wide receivers 8 through 15. And so with that said, I want to recall my top 7 wide receivers just to make it clear where we're starting here, and then I will be going to wide receiver 15 first and then making my way back up to wide receiver 8. So my wide receiver 1 is Marvin Harrison Jr. At wide receiver 2, I have Malik Neighbors. At wide receiver 3, I have Rome Odunze. At wide receiver 4, I have Keon Coleman. At wide receiver 5, I have Troy Franklin. At wide receiver 6, I have Adonai Mitchell. And at wide receiver 7, I have Brian Thomas Jr. Now, those rankings are obviously very fluid as well, and as are these, but on that note, it's important to just get into it. So at wide receiver 15, I have Brendan Rice, the wide receiver from USC. So wide receiver 15 on my list is Brendan Rice, the wide receiver out of USC, who once played at Colorado and also has a very famous father. He's one of the younger prospects on this list in particular, but he would be older than most, if not all, of the top 7, just by how that kind of early declare analytical line is shaping up in my rankings right now. The big thing about Brendan Rice is that he does have a lot of the tools that you want to check. 6'2", 212, 32 and 5/8 inch arms. It doesn't matter what kind of size profile you look for, that's going to be a good one, right? And it's definitely not going to have any room for concern there. That said, the biggest concern I've had for Brendan Rice throughout the entire process is just the fact that he has 6 games this year under 50 yards, 5 under 40, and 1 was just 1 for 75 and a touchdown against Stanford. This is kind of a specific and technical way to look at it, but the point is just that with Caleb Williams as his quarterback, he constantly wasn't an incredibly impactful player at the collegiate level. It's also important to note that while Caleb Williams was disappointing in a lot of ways, and there's other podcasts, including different episodes of this one to talk about that, he did put up the kind of volume yards that Brendan Rice's numbers in this case aren't really defensible. In 12 games, there were a hair under 4,000 passing yards for the USC Trojans, and Brendan Rice had 20%. 20% is not a good number at all. I usually consider around 25% to be the minimum of what I'm looking for to consider somebody having at least a good production profile. Being below 20% is very bad, and again, while 2205 in terms of being 22 years 5 months old as of September 1st is fairly young in terms of this specific list of wide receivers 8 through 15. Analytically, it's not young enough for me to not worry about the production things. That said, he did show up nice at the Senior Bowl. He's shown some nice things on big plays, and again, it's all those physical boxes that he checks. There's a couple wide receivers I don't want to talk about yet because they are honorable mentions, and so they will be mentioned at the end, who are also physical, who some people might put in this last spot or above as well. But I think Brendan Rice is the one I think I would bet on if I was betting on one of the physical archetypes. Up next, I have Ladd McConkey, the wide receiver from Georgia, which probably marks my first ranking that has a chance to be fairly controversial. Ladd McConkey is about 5 months older than Rice was, right around that 20. He's getting up close to 23 years old at the start of the upcoming football season. While he is fairly tall, both of the other aspects of size rank worse for McConkey, including his arm length, which is particularly bad at 30 and 1/8 inch. And by the way, with Rice too, these are verified by at least one unbiased source. So the 30 and 1/8 inch arm length, those are short arms for somebody who is that tall. To put that in comparison, Ladd McConkey is in the 27th or 28th percentile in height and the 8th percentile in arm length. Ladd McConkey is a player who, when I decided to do this 8 to 15 rank, I would have thought he was much higher up. but as I continued to look through it, I just kept having problems with the profile itself, particularly for one that is this far down. Now, to be clear, there's things that I absolutely love about McConkey and that everybody will tell you about McConkey that are all really based around his ability to either route run or have elite ability to start, stop, and gear shift, depending on how you're phrasing it. All of these things I do believe are true, but at the end of the day, the biggest reason why wide receiver production matters so much is that it helps show that you use your traits to win. Ladd McConkey's production is not just bad, it is downright awful the more you dig into it. He has played in 39 career games, and yes, he has been injured for some of them, including played through injury in many of them, but he has 1,687 career yards. That is a very small number for 39 career games. Now, the first thing that people will say when you mention that is that he played for Georgia and Georgia spreads the ball around and all those things, and I get that. I really do. But in the games that Ladd McConkey was healthy and active in 2022, the Georgia Bulldogs threw for 4,438 passing yards. It wasn't like they didn't move the ball. With 762 receiving yards, that's only 17.2%. Again, that's a worse number than the Rice number I was just worried about. And you can say, well, maybe he's missing out on a lot of snaps because of second halves. Well, his yards per out run is 2.16, which isn't particularly bad, but it's certainly not great, especially for a prospect that is getting close to 23 years old around not the time of the draft, but the time the season begins, and just doesn't have the elite traits that you're looking for when you're talking about projectable wide receivers. Now, again, his yards per out run was much better within that 2023 sample, and that's important to note. But again, to me, what you learn when you watch a wide receiver over time are things like, are people going to figure this guy out? Are cornerbacks going to get better at tracking how McConkey does certain things? Could he possibly have a learning curve that maybe he's not actually as good at actually eluding defensive backs as we think he is? I understand why we believe that Ladd McConkey can do it at a high level, because again, I do like his elite ability to gear shift or just simply route run, however you want to phrase it. But the fact of the matter is, Ladd McConkey just really hasn't done it at any kind of a relevant level, and so for that reason, I have him quite a bit further down my rankings. Another player I find to be kind of similar to this is Roman Wilson, but they're fairly different in rank. But I will touch upon Ladd McConkey a little bit again when I get to Roman Wilson. Up next at wide receiver 13, I have one of my bigger fallers at this point, and that is wide receiver Devontae Walker of North Carolina. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we talk about things like the Senior Bowl and fallers for the Senior Bowl, of which Devontae Walker is one of them, being a faller due to the Senior Bowl is partially potentially due to the Senior Bowl, but it's also about the reevaluation that occurs during that time period. Games like the Senior Bowl and the Shrine Bowl, they give us opportunities to focus on select groups of players that we can then reevaluate and reassess over a period of time where, say, there's less football. One thing to note about Devontae Walker is that his downward slide really didn't start at the Senior Bowl. It started with the last 2 games of the season. In those 2 games, Devontae Walker had 18 targets, 6 receptions, and did have 2 drops as well. Now, he might have the best speed score in the class, meaning like size adjusted 40, and he is a vertical tree wide receiver, or at least that's the way he was used consistently at North Carolina, and it does seem like he can potentially work in that role. But the Senior Bowl was this opportunity for Tez Walker in particular to prove that he could operate in some different areas. So while you don't want to make too much of it, especially because in just general, drops, which were the problem he was quoted with having the most at the Senior Bowl, are a very fluky thing from time to time, it did ruin an opportunity that Tez Walker had to improve his stock or to prove to people that he could do a couple of different things. So at the end of the day, I think the biggest problem with Tez Walker just goes to the big analytical and production things, right? He is over 23 years old on September 1st. He had huge games this year against Miami, Virginia, and Duke, but he was not consistent this year. And so his best season at this point is probably his Kent State year from the year before. And so that's a 900-yard season against MAC competition. So ultimately, while there are things I like physically in Tez Walker, such as, the ability to have that number one speed score potentially in the class. I'm just not sold on Tez Walker outside of being this pure vertical tree wide receiver. And so on that note, with 3 wide receivers down, I figure it's time for just a really quick recap. At wide receiver 15, I have Brendan Rice of USC. At wide receiver 14, I have Ladd McConkey of Georgia. At wide receiver 13, I have Tez Walker of North Carolina. And at wide receiver 12, I have Malachi Corley of Western Kentucky. The most notable thing that basically anybody will tell you right away about Malachi Corley is that he is a yak beast. Now, Western Kentucky, the biggest red flag that pops up right away is that is one of the lowest FBS conferences you can play at in the Conference USA. However, it's important to note that, the one thing that you worry about sometimes is how people translate physically when they're coming from lower conferences, and Malachi Corley was a member of Bruce Feldman's Freaks List. Now, if you're not familiar with what Bruce Feldman's Freaks List is, it's a piece on The Athletic that tries to rank the 100 most freakiest athletes in college football. Malachi Corley made this list, and one of the key things that was mentioned on this list was a reported GPS time of 23 miles an hour. Now, people often accuse these lists of being fluffed up a bit, and I want to say 2 things on that subject. 1, they probably are. And 2, it's also important to remember that at a glance we might forget that there is a difference between a personal best and, say, something that you might do in 2 reps on a Thursday afternoon. Now, as high level as athletes get, as repeatable as the things they do are, it's just hard to know for 100% certain that somebody's 2 reps at the combine at any event are going to necessarily match their personal best. So I guess what I'm ultimately saying in this is that it doesn't really matter what the exact measurements are for Malachi Corley. This just seems to be a confirmation that physically he can translate to the next level. And then while we don't have any confirmations in terms of speed or GPS times, at least not from any data I have access to in terms of GPS times, Malachi Corley is 5'10 and a half, 215, and with almost 31-inch arms according to the Senior Bowl. In particular, that 215-pound weight measurement is 85th percentile. The problem with Malachi Corley, though, is that at this lower level of competition, at Western Kentucky, in Conference USA, he had an extremely low ADOT, or average depth of target. He is very much untested as a wide receiver working in deeper down the field or in intermediate routes consistently. So while Malachi Corley is this player who you can pencil in as being able to do one thing very well, and maybe for that thing alone he should be ranked higher up on this list, it's natural to be skeptical that he can do other things because, generally speaking, when players get put in very specific boxes at very low levels, that's not a good indication that they can be opened up a considerable amount at the next level. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but Malachi Corley is just this guy where everything beyond these short route yak game is a lot of a projection. He is kind of similar to Brendan Rice, 22 years, 5 months on my list as of September 1st. So he is one of the younger players on this list, one of the younger players for not being an early declare. But at the end of the day, Malachi Corley is a player that I actually think will go pretty high in the NFL, at least compared to some of these guys. I do think he kind of has a safe draft floor because I think some team is going to buy in to the fact that he's 215 pounds. I do think the speed is legitimate, and he's got one thing that he can provide to a team. I don't think he matches up like physically perfectly to this player or even analytically perfectly to this player, but from a draft capital perspective, I could see a team viewing him like Wan'Dale Robinson, who went in the top 50. On the next note, the player who has risen the most for me since this podcast began, at wide receiver 11, Malik Washington, the wide receiver from Virginia. Now, I don't have a birthday on Malik Washington yet, but he is a 5th-year player, and he is 5'8", so let's just get those 2 things out of the way right now. I also haven't brought this up too much, but obviously a lot of these players have been talked about in other shows, and so I don't want to get too repetitive with saying the exact same things, and the last show had Malik Washington in the name of it, and so I obviously talked about him a good bit in that. In order to kind of change up some of the recap, though, I want to specifically talk about Malik Washington through the lens of comparison, because while it is easy to see this comparison as being, potentially clickbaity or something of that nature, there really are a lot of comparisons when you dig into it between Malik Washington and Tank Dell. Aside from just being 5'8", neither player broke out in terms of a higher level in college football until their fourth season. Now, Malik Washington only had 700 yards in that fourth season, but going back to the proportions, that was 27 or over 27% of his team's receiving yards, and only Evan Hall had more than, say, 250 receiving yards on the team. So Malik Washington was a big part of the proportions of his Northwestern offense in year four. And then both players, in terms of Dell and Washington, have slightly longer arms than their height. Now, Washington's arms are slightly lower in the 7th percentile. Dell's are in the 14th, but these are pretty much the same thing. For smaller wide receivers, having long arms, I have found is more often to generate success at the NFL level. And again, just watch the last podcast if you're confused by what I mean by that. It's also important to note that at his peak season and his final season, Tank Dell had 1,398 yards, while Washington had 1,426. But Dell's team threw for 4,082 yards, when Washington's only threw for 3,010. The difference in proportion there is pretty significant. It's also important to note that while Tank Dell does have slightly longer arms than Washington, Washington weighed in at 27 pounds heavier than Tank Dell. Tank Dell was in the 1st percentile in weight, while Washington is in the 27th. Washington shined at the Shrine Bowl practices, and so when you consider that this is a player who had 47.4% of his offensive production at the ACC level, this is a player that you really do see where the comparison comes from. Because a lot of times, there are certain players, even players in this class that are smaller, that I don't like the comparison to Tank Dell, and the main reason I say that I don't like the comparison to Tank Dell when people ask me why I don't like it is because what makes Tank Dell good is not being small. What makes Tank Dell good is all the other stuff. Being small is obviously a part of who he is, but it's not what makes him good necessarily. Washington has all these same things in terms of he's very physical and tenacious at the point of attack. He can get contested catches. He can go up and come down with the ball. He's also probably a better yak receiver in terms of just projecting from the previous level. He has a lot of missed forced tackles, and in terms of projecting to the next level, it is possible at least to see that continuing when you consider that 27 pounds is a big deal for a guy who's 5'8". Malik Washington has a very nice BMI overall, especially for a wide receiver to be able to shake and bake some of those corners. Now, Malik Washington is a player who I have higher than anybody else I see that, say, isn't on very many guys' lists in day two. So for that reason, I do feel a little bit like I'm on an island with Malik Washington. I will also say that prior to the draft and prior to getting day two capital, I completely dismissed Tank Dell last year, and that was one of my biggest mistakes. So I think it's important for me to note that as much as I talk about how other teams shouldn't chase Puka Nacuas or things like this, I'm worried that I'm chasing a Tank Dell a little bit, but I also believe that the justification is there significantly just because on paper, I would argue that Malik Washington's profile is better than Tank Dell's. Now, don't get me wrong, if you were in a league where they were both tradable assets right now, there's no way I would trade Tank Dell from Malik Washington. But when I consider the fact that he doesn't have the significant BMI red flag, he played in the Power 5 conference, and he had a higher proportion in that Power 5 conference of at 47.4%, I could definitely see a world where just on a lot of models and on paper and in a lot of different perspectives, Malik Washington is the better prospect on paper, at least going into the draft. So Malik Washington is this player who has dominated when given the opportunity. His first 3 years, he had significant excuses that did get in the way of him being able to dominate. And with the peak season being as spectacular as it is, at a position where production is so important, I have Malik Washington all the way up at my wide receiver 11. And so just to recap what I have so far, I have Brendan Rice at wide receiver 15, Ladd McConkey at wide receiver 14, Devontae Walker at wide receiver 13, Malachi Corley at wide receiver 12, and Malik Washington at wide receiver 11. Before I get into my last 3 wide receivers on this video, I would like to encourage anyone who is enjoying the content to subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to me, and if you think there's something meaningful about this content, it will also help let you know when I post things like my mid-tier running back rankings later this week. So once again, do please subscribe, and on to my wide receiver 10. So keeping in mind the numbers are a little bit awkward on this list because we're doing 8 through 15 because the top 7 were the ones I'd ranked before. Starting into my top 10 on this list, we start with wide receiver 10, Jalen Polk of Washington. One of the first things that comes to mind to talk about with Jalen Polk is just the fact that he seems to be one of the guys that seems to get consistent buzz around NFL circles from different publications, which is something that I look for. By which I just mean he's not necessarily always ranked in the first round, but he's someone that I see a lot of respect for and not a lot of people pushing down necessarily. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he will get drafted highly, but if you asked me to guess on this entire list of 8 through 15, between who I think would go in the top 50, say, the only player I would put at the same odds as Jalen Polk would be Xavier Worthy, who's about to come up in a couple spots. A couple big things to note about Jalen Polk is that he has very good size and he's a very strong player at the point of attack. In fact, I think he wins at a number of phases at the point of attacks, which is what really intrigues NFL teams. By which I mean he wins at release points, he wins at catch points, he often wins at breaking tackles. And so these are things I think teams are really keying in on with Jalen Polk. It's important to note, though, that Jalen Polk's overall production is really not all that good, and it's particularly not all that good when you look at it, again, through this proportional lens. So he had a fairly decent season in his freshman season, at least what you expect a freshman to do at Texas Tech, and then he decided to transfer to Washington. At Washington, he really didn't do much for his first 2 years, and a key important detail is that in year 3, as in 2022, Jalen McMillan put up far better statistics than Jalen Polk, with 38 more receptions, 400 more yards, and 3 more touchdowns. Jalen Polk himself had fewer than 700 yards, so that's a pretty big difference between the two. It's also important to note that Jalen McMillan is a member of this class and not in this top 15. While 1,159 yards looks very good, when you compare that to a proportion that goes over 5,000, it gets to 22.5%. That is not a number we are looking for. Now, one thing to note about Jalen Polk's production profile is that he did have 2 complete zeros in back-to-back games against Oregon State and Washington State. Maybe injury was part of that, maybe it was the weather that was affecting those games, and Penix was bad in those games as well. But it is worth noting that he got complete zeros, and there were plays that Penix got him the ball in areas where he could catch it, and they resulted in drops. Now, again, with all the weather, there's a lot of inconsistencies happening there, so it just is important to note this because those 2 games had a significant impact on the proportions for Jalen Polk. So once again, for Jalen Polk, it is the different points of attack that he wins at that are so intriguing to me. He has good size, and compared to a Brendan Rice, he does have a lot better production. So while the production is not great, and I don't think it looks great under the scrutiny that I like to put under production, it is still important to note that it's better than a lot of the players that we're projecting with these bigger projectable frames. And so Polk has that and the ability to win in a few different ways, and so that makes him my wide receiver 10. Up next at wide receiver 9, I have Roman Wilson of Michigan. Roman Wilson is another one of the older players on this list and will be 23 years old before September starts, but I find myself very intrigued by his set of tools. Now, to be clear, Roman Wilson is also a bit of a projection, kind of like I talked about with Ladd McConkey earlier. The big projection with Roman Wilson is that we've really never seen him in a high target role. Roman Wilson spent all 4 years at Michigan, and in the first 3 of them, he had under 40 targets. In year 4, he had between 60 and 70, which is a substantial increase, but ultimately not a lot. And in terms of individual games, he went over 4 targets twice, with one of those games being against a mid-major, or a group of 5 team. However, the 789 yards that Roman Wilson had were proportionately a significantly higher rate than Ladd McConkey's 700-yard season, where Ladd McConkey's season was 17% of his team's receiving yards, Roman Wilson's was 24%. And while Ladd McConkey's 700-yard season came with a 2.1 yards per out run, Roman Wilson's was almost 2.7. That said, I still do believe that it's important to look at Roman Wilson as a projection, because any player who in 4 years of college football at his peak season had really 1 game of significance over 4 targets is a projection. And it's kind of interesting to me because the wide receivers that we usually think about as project wide receivers are players like Xavier Legette, who didn't crack my top 15, Brendan Rice, who did, Devontae Walker, guys who are big, long. Those are the guys we usually think of projection wide receivers. And in this draft, it seems like some of the projected wide receivers or the project wide receivers that are getting the most hype are Ladd McConkey and Roman Wilson. And I get why some people would think of them as not projects just because of the fact they're considered to be technically proficient in terms of route running and things of this nature. But the fact of the matter is, to me, they haven't really proven the ability to separate, even if they can, even if they can do it in a vacuum, even if they can do it on air, they haven't proven the ability to be productive. So to me, they are projects because you're projecting the volume into these players, and that what's intriguing to me about that is that I'm wondering if that's a reaction to the Puka Nacua thing, because that is what Puka Nacua is. Puka Nacua is a project wide receiver who does not align with a typical project wide receiver. He wins with his separation and route running, and he was a project because he played fewer routes in 4 years of college football than he played this year with the Rams. Now, regardless of anything else, I really doubt that any wide receiver in the next couple of years turns out to be a Puka Nacua for several reasons. But I do think one thing to keep in mind about Puka Nacua is that for some reason I think sometimes when a guy isn't very big, we sometimes consider that the same as guys who are somewhat undersized, by which I just mean Roman Wilson's size triangle is 16th percentile height, 18th percentile weight, and 10th percentile arm length. Puka's is 60th, 49th, and 36th. Basically, Puka Nacua is substantially bigger in a number of percentiles, including being above average in height, average in weight, and at least 36th percentile in arm length. So ultimately, I do see Roman Wilson as a project wide receiver to an extent, or a projection at the next level, because we've never seen him in a high volume role. But I do have a wide receiver 9 because I believe in the projection a little bit. Once again, all of these players are fairly likely to be busts just by the nature of the position itself. So keeping that in mind, a player like Roman Wilson, who separates well, has really good deep speed, has slightly longer arms than Ladd McConkey, so he gets a little bit further away from that red flag area, and also doesn't have the same production red flag that I have with Ladd McConkey because the peak season is significantly better. He's checking a lot more boxes. I really like him as this projectable wide receiver. I think he has real clean hands, can be physical at the catch point for his size. So I really like Roman Wilson in this projection role a lot more than Ladd McConkey. I do think both are projections, and I do think it might be smart to move in the direction generally of making project wide receivers based more on Puka Nacua than, say, worse versions of DK Metcalf. But regardless of any of that, I think Roman Wilson is my wide receiver 9 and a guy who I'm willing to take a bet on at this point. Up next, the youngest player in this class by about a full year, the only early declare on this list, my wide receiver 8, Texas wide receiver Xavier Worthy. Aside from being the youngest player in this class and at 2104 on my age list, he's also one of the youngest wide receivers I've evaluated over the last 3 years. Xavier Worthy is also the fastest player in this class. Now, I mentioned other players that might have a higher speed score, which adjusts 40 times by weight, and that's certainly true that a lot of players on this list might have better weight adjusted 40s, but when it comes to pure, raw speed, there is no one in this class quite like Xavier Worthy. Another thing that Xavier Worthy has under his belt is an elite freshman season. He had 2.6 yards per route run as a freshman and had a great proportion of his team's freshman production. And while I do have some concerns about him at physical points of the game, it is really hard to doubt his ability as a screen threat. He can take any pass to the house at any point. However, it's also important to note that the 2.6 yards per route run mark a career high and a significant career high. While the 1.9 yards per route run in his sophomore year was excused somewhat by a broken hand, he only jumped up to 2.1 as a junior, and this was a year where you would have expected it to be far better with Quinn Ewers at quarterback. The big concern I have is that there is something on Xavier Worthy's film that bothers me more than any other wide receiver in this class, and that is just his ability to play with strength and at the point of attack. Xavier Worthy is just not a very strong point of attack player to me, particularly at the catch point, and when you look at some of his game films, the BYU game was the one I mentioned in the previous podcast when I mentioned this. It's available on YouTube, and it's the one that comes to mind just because he had so many targets in that game. But you can see it throughout his tape, and I also think that's why you see him getting mocked more and more often in the second round. To be honest, when I started this list, I had Xavier Worthy a bit lower because that one thing in particular is just a hard thing for me to justify ranking him highly on. That said, as much as I'm analytical on these prospects, I also try to be self-analytical. And because this is such a different thing than anybody else, and because there are so many things that I can point to that Xavier Worthy does well, and because there are things analytically that he scores so high on, and because there are things on a football field with his speed that I feel like I can buy into, Xavier Worthy still comes in as my wide receiver 8. And so with Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 8, I now have a full list of 1 through 15. At wide receiver 1, Marvin Harrison. At 2, Malik Neighbors. At 3, Roma Dunze. At 4, Keon Coleman. At 5, Troy Franklin. At 6, Adonai Mitchell. At 7, Brian Thomas Jr. At 8, Xavier Worthy. At 9, Roman Wilson. At 10, Jalen Polk. At 11, Malik Washington. At 12, Malachi Corley. At 13, Devontae Walker. At 14, Lad McConkey. At 15, Brendan Rice. And with some honorable mentions still to come. So for those honorable mentions, the big controversy that's not on this list most likely will be Xavier Legette. I've really never been a big fan of Xavier Legette. And Xavier Legette's just one of those players that is really hard for me to place just because as somebody who really spends a lot of time with a lot of these players ahead of schedule and before they come into the public eye a lot of the times, players like Xavier Legette who have such a small peak are very hard for me to deal with because they come essentially out of nowhere and then they don't stay really. Xavier Legette didn't consistently sustain the high level performances. He had some good ones, but he also had some fall off performances. He measures in at 6'1" instead of 6'3" at the Senior Bowl, and he doesn't have a good day there overall. And so it's not that I'm necessarily feeling like I'm overreacting to these small things so much as it's just I don't necessarily feel like the profile itself is built on all that much. I feel like it was built, very quickly overnight, and that's why it kind of feels like it's blowing down so easily, at least for me. Xavier Legette has a lot of tools. He's very intriguing, and like I said at the very beginning, and like I will continue to say on this show throughout however long I end up doing this show, I will be wrong a lot, and I might be wrong on Xavier Legette, but he is a controversial player that is even not my number one honorable mention, because my number one honorable mention would probably be Javon Baker. Javon Baker is another athletic player. He played on a very rush-heavy team, and so you kind of hope that you see some development as he gets into the NFL level. He played for the University of Central Florida. Jalen McMillan, who is mentioned with Jalen Polk as they are teammates at Washington, is another wide receiver I have on the honorable mentions. He succeeds very well underneath, and he's a very intriguing player on that level. I'm just not sure if he has the other aspects of his game as much as some of these other players. Johnny Wilson, very large, very long wingspan, has concentration drops that have bothered him and plagued him throughout his entire career. Don't really know what to do with him, but just someone that I keep an eye on. And then Ricky Pearsall. If you want to hear more on Ricky Pearsall, I did talk about him a couple shows ago. He's just a player I don't like as much as the market right now. And that is all I have for this wide receiver position. So that's all I have for the show today. If you did enjoy the content and have not liked the video, I would again encourage you to do so, or alternatively, to leave a comment and let me know how you think I'm doing. I do hope the production will steadily improve. The running back ranks this week will likely match this video, both in terms of visually and audio, but I'm hoping future recordings will continue to improve in quality. With that said, the only thing left I have to say is welcome to draft season, my friends.